The seeds were scattered across the dirt floor of the general store, and every single person in Caldwell, Kansas stood watching as Fannie Gentry dropped to her knees to gather them with trembling hands. "You brought weeds into my town," said Harlan Price, his boot heel grinding down on a small cloth pouch before she could reach it. The sound it made, that soft, devastating crunch, hit her somewhere deeper than any wound she had ever known. Weeds and foreign nonsense and God knows what else. Fannie looked up at the man who had promised her safety through the letters. The man who had paid for her passage from the port of New Orleans all the way out to the Kansas plains. The man who had called her my intended in careful, looping script that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. "Those are not weeds," she said, and her voice did not break, though everything else inside her was cracking clean through. "Those are pomegranate seeds and fig cuttings and herbs my mother dried with her own hands before she died. You will not grind them into nothing." Harlan Price was a broad man with a pale, bloated face and small eyes that had never learned how to show mercy. He lifted his boot and she scrambled forward, scooping what she could back into her apron pocket, and the people of Caldwell watched without a single word of defense rising among them. All except one man in the doorway. Isaiah Brooks had not moved from the threshold of Price's general store since the shouting started. He had only come in to purchase flour, and he had ended up witnessing something that had lodged in him like a splinter, painful, insistent, impossible to ignore. He watched the woman on her knees. He watched her hands, careful and desperate at once, gathering those seeds like they were the last living pieces of something she could not replace. He watched her spine straight even in humiliation, and then he stepped forward. "That is enough, Harlan." The words came out quieter than he intended, but they filled the room entirely. Harlan Price turned his head with the slow, contemptuous rotation of a man who expected no real challenge. "Stay out of this, Brooks. This does not concern you." "She is on her knees in your dirt floor," Isaiah said, "and you are destroying property that belongs to her. It concerns me just fine." This is where the story truly begins. Not with arrival or departure or the long, dusty miles between them, but with a man choosing to step forward when every other soul in that room had chosen to step back. And with a woman who had already survived enough losses to know exactly what it meant when someone chose to stand beside her instead. But to understand what brought Fannie Gentry to her knees on that floor, you have to go back to the beginning. 6 weeks earlier, Fannie Gentry had been standing at the stern of a steamboat watching the mouth of the Mississippi open itself into the flat, shimmering expanse of the Gulf, and she had been rehearsing the lies she might have to tell. She was 24 years old. She was Lebanese, born in a mountain village above Beirut where the air smelled of cedar and thyme, and the terraced hillsides grew things in colors so rich they looked painted. Her mother had been a farmer's daughter who knew every plant by name and season. Her father had been a merchant who sailed to Alexandria twice a year and brought back spices and silk and stories. Both of them were gone now, her father to a fever that swept through the port in the winter of 1876, her mother to grief, and then to a second fever the following spring, as though her body had decided it was simply done. That had left Fannie with her aunt in Beirut, her aunt's cramped house, and a slowly shrinking pile of money that would not survive another year. The letters her cousin had received from men in America, men looking for wives who were willing to work, willing to travel, willing to start from nothing, had seemed, at first, like a desperate and ridiculous solution. Then they had begun to seem like the only solution. She had written to 3 men. 2 had not responded. The third had been Harlan Price of Caldwell, Kansas, who had described himself as a prosperous merchant and landowner, who wanted a capable and industrious wife with good moral character. He had sent her $40 for passage and told her to arrive no later than the first week of April. The year was 1878. The Kansas plains were just beginning their season of becoming. Fannie had packed everything she owned into 2 trunks, and at the very last moment, standing in her mother's empty bedroom, She had added a small tin box filled with seeds and dried cuttings and roots wrapped carefully in damp cloth, pomegranate seeds from the tree in their courtyard, fig cuttings from the oldest tree on their hillside, dried za'atar and sage and wild chamomile. Tiny, hard olive pits she was almost certainly too far north to ever grow. They were not practical, she knew this. A botanist would have laughed, but they were her mother's hands preserved in botanical form, and she could not leave them behind. The journey from Beirut to New Orleans alone had taken 3 weeks by steamship, crossing a sea that grew rougher the farther west she traveled. She spoke Arabic and French, and was learning English from a small grammar book she had purchased in Beirut, practicing it quietly in her cabin each night, until the words began to feel less like strange furniture in her mouth, and more like things she could actually move around in. By the time she arrived in New Orleans, her English was serviceable. Accented, careful, sometimes wrong in small ways that made people tilt their heads, but serviceable. The train from New Orleans to Wichita took another 4 days, and then a hired wagon brought her the final 20 miles south to Caldwell. She had arrived at the end of March, a full week early, which was perhaps her first mistake. Harlan Price had not expected her. He had been annoyed at her presence even before she spoke, which should have told her something significant about the nature of the life she had been promised. It had taken her exactly 3 days to understand that Harlan Price was not a good man. He had shown her the small room at the back of his store where she was expected to sleep on a pallet. He had handed her an apron and told her to start inventorying dry goods. He had not asked her a single question about herself, and had responded to every small piece of information she volunteered with the focused disinterest of a man who considered other people primarily as useful tools. He had mentioned the upcoming marriage the way another man might mention an upcoming shipment of hardware, with logistical attention but no warmth whatsoever. She had been afraid, and she had hidden it well. She had done the inventory. She had cooked for him using what she could find in his meager kitchen, and the food had been better than anything he had eaten in years, though he had never said so. She had watched the town through the store windows and tried to determine whether there was any path forward that did not involve Harlan Price. She had not yet found one when the confrontation happened. She had made the mistake of taking out her tin box in the back room during a quiet afternoon, opening it to check on the cuttings, trimming a bit of dried material here and there. Harlan had come around the corner and seen her handling what he apparently decided were suspicious foreign objects, and something in him, something petty and territorial and ugly, had ignited. He had grabbed the box. She had fought to keep it. Seeds had scattered, and that was where Isaiah Brooks had found them. Now Isaiah stood between Fannie and Harlan Price, which was not a position he had planned for his Tuesday morning, but which felt, with a strange and settled certainty, like exactly where he was supposed to be. "She has nowhere to go," Harlan said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "She came here as my intended. She arrived without warning. She has been living in my store on my hospitality, and frankly she has been nothing but trouble. Is that the truth of it?" Isaiah asked, and he looked at Fannie, still crouching near the floor, her dark eyes measuring him with an intelligence that was not hidden at all. "No," she said simply. "I didn't think so," he said. Turned back to Harlan. "I'll be taking her to Mrs. Alderman's boarding house. You'll leave her be, and if I hear you've harassed her further, you and I will have a much less friendly conversation." Harlan's small eyes narrowed. "You have no right." "I have every right," Isaiah said, and there was something in his tone that ended the sentence, ended the argument, ended the entire confrontation with a kind of quiet finality that Harlan Price, for all his bluster, recognized as the real thing. He was a bully. Bullies know when they have genuinely miscalculated. Isaiah helped Fannie to her feet. His hand was large and rough-calloused and careful, and when she straightened up, she was almost exactly at his shoulder height, which put her at a slight angle to look up into his face. It was a lean, sun-darkened face, the kind that had been shaped by years of outdoor work into something that was more interesting than conventionally handsome. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they looked at her with the direct and uncomplicated steadiness of a person who was simply seeing her, rather than cataloging her like livestock at auction. "Do you have bags?" he asked. "2 trunks," she said. "In the back room." "I'll get them." He collected her trunks himself, both at once, carrying them the 3 blocks to the boarding house without ceremony or complaint, and Fannie walked beside him carrying her tin box and her apron, and the small English grammar book she had not let out of her sight since New Orleans. Mrs. Alderman was a stout widow woman of about 55 who ran a clean, orderly boarding house and had opinions about everything. She looked at Fannie with frank curiosity and at Isaiah with the satisfied expression of a woman who had suspected something about a man for years and was now watching her suspicion validated. "She'll need a room," Isaiah said. "I can see that," Mrs. Alderman said. "Can she pay?" Isaiah looked at Fannie, who opened her mouth to explain that she had very limited funds. "And I'll cover the first month," Isaiah said. "After that she'll have worked something out." Fannie turned to look at him sharply. "I do not want charity." "It's not charity," he said without hesitation. "It's credit. You can pay me back whenever you're able. There's no rush and no interest and no condition attached to it." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. In her experience, no condition was itself a condition, a claim she did not yet know the shape of, but there was nothing in his face that suggested calculation, just a frank and simple offer. "Thank you," she said carefully. "I will pay you back." "I know you will," he said, and it sounded like he meant it. He left. She stood in the small, clean room at the top of Mrs. Alderman's stairs and pressed her back against the closed door and breathed. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and opened her tin box and checked the seeds one by one and found that most of them had survived. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, a great deal. Isaiah Brooks had come to Caldwell, Kansas from Tennessee, which he did not talk about much, because Tennessee was behind him and the past was the past, and he found that looking backward gave him a crick in the neck. He was 31 years old. He had come west at 22 with $40 and the sort of relentless practical energy that the frontier rewarded, and he had spent 9 years building something small but solid. He owned a farm of about 340 acres on the southern edge of the county, where the land flattened out into a wide, gentle basin that got reasonable water from a creek that ran year-round except in the worst droughts. He grew wheat and kept a small cattle herd and had 2 good horses and a wagon and a farmhouse that he had built himself 4 years ago when he had finally saved enough lumber. The farmhouse was better than adequate. It had 4 rooms, a stone fireplace, a covered porch that faced east for the morning light, and a kitchen with a proper wood stove. It also had, in his objective assessment, a profound silence that had begun in the last year or two to feel less like peace and more like absence. He was not a man who talked about loneliness. He was not particularly sure he would have called it that if asked. He called it something more practical, an inefficiency, a resource he was not using properly, the single unused bedroom that could be doing something more useful than sitting empty. He had thought vaguely about the question of a wife the way he thought about most long-range planning, methodically, without urgency, aware that the right arrangement would present itself eventually, and that forcing the wrong one would be costlier than waiting. He had not, however, expected the right arrangement to appear on her knees on the floor of Harlan Price's general store, gathering pomegranate seeds from the dirt. In the week after he installed Fannie at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house, Isaiah found reasons to come into town more often than his schedule strictly required. He told himself this was coincidental. He was not, as a general rule, prone to self-deception, so this particular lie lasted approximately 24 hours before he acknowledged what he was actually doing. He brought her flour and a small jar of honey on the second day, under the stated premise that he owed Mrs. Alderman something for taking in a boarder on short notice. Mrs. Alderman accepted this explanation with a smile that suggested she was not even slightly deceived. Fanny was in the back garden when he arrived, and Mrs. Alderman called her in, and she came through the back door with dirt on her hands and a question in her eyes. And she was, Isaiah thought with a sharpness that surprised him, extraordinarily beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or the current standard of beauty in Caldwell, Kansas, and everything to do with the quality of her attention, and the way she moved through a space as though she understood exactly what it required of her. "You are bringing supplies," she said, looking at the flour and honey. "I was at the store anyway," he said. "Mrs. Alderman does not need flour," Fanny said, with the direct honesty of a woman who had navigated too many complicated situations to waste time pretending. "She bought flour 4 days ago. I helped carry it." "Well," he said, she almost smiled. It was just a small movement at the corner of her mouth, but it changed her whole face and landed somewhere in his chest with a small, significant impact. "Thank you for the honey," she said. "Would you like tea?" He stayed for 2 hours. They sat at Mrs. Alderman's kitchen table and drank tea that Fanny made with dried mint from her tin box mint, that smelled like nothing he had ever encountered, green and cool, and vivid in a way that made the kitchen feel momentarily larger. And she asked him questions about the land and the soil and the weather patterns and the rainfall averages and the length of the growing seasons. And the questions were so precise and technically specific that he found himself leaning forward over the table, answering with a seriousness that matched hers. "What is your soil like?" she asked. "The deep layer below the topsoil, is it clay, loam, sandy?" "Clay subsoil," he said, "but the topsoil is rich. Creek deposits have been building it for decades." "And the alkalinity, do you know?" He blinked. "I don't exactly. Crops do well, so I've always assumed it's reasonable." "Figs prefer slightly alkaline soil," she said, almost to herself, and then caught herself and looked up. "I apologize, I was thinking about my seeds." "Don't apologize," he said. "What are you planning to do with them?" She paused, and something shifted in her expression, a careful weighing, a decision about how much to reveal to a man who had been kind but was still, after all, a stranger. "My mother was a farmer," she said. "Before she married my father, her family farmed a hillside that had been farmed by our family for at least 200 years. She knew those plants completely, every variety, every growing condition, every way to preserve and propagate them. She looked down at her hands. She gave me seeds and cuttings when I left. She was already very ill. I think she knew she would not be alive when I arrived. She wanted something of hers to grow somewhere new." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire. "I am sorry about your mother," Isaiah said. "Thank you." She was quiet for a moment, and then, "The seeds will grow if I can find the right soil. My mother always said that plants want to live. You just have to give them a fair chance." "I have 340 acres," Isaiah said. "Most of it hasn't been touched yet." She looked at him. He looked at her. The mockingbird outside ran through a sequence that included what sounded like a meadowlark and then something entirely its own invention. "I am not yet sure of my situation here," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I'm not pressing you for anything. I'm just saying, if you want soil, I have soil." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for both of them to understand that they were not entirely talking about seeds anymore. "I will consider it," she said. He walked home that evening over the 2 miles of open grassland between Caldwell and his farm, and the prairie was golden in the late light, and he caught himself thinking about a woman's hands sorting seeds on a kitchen table, and he thought, this is going to change things. He was not sure exactly how, but he had always trusted his instincts about large, irreversible shifts, and this felt like one. Harlan Price was not finished. Fanny had understood from the beginning that a man like Harlan would not simply accept a rebuff and redirect himself to other interests. Men like Harlan measured themselves entirely in terms of what they could control, and a woman who had escaped his control worse, who had been visibly removed from his control by another man, in front of witnesses, was a wound to his pride that would fester until he did something about it. He started with talk. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town of about 2,000 souls, situated on the Kishom Trail right at the Kansas-Indian Territory border. It was not a genteel place, but it had its social structures and its gossips and its networks of opinion that could, if properly cultivated, make a stranger's life very uncomfortable. Harlan told anyone who would listen that Fannie was a foreign woman of dubious character who had arrived in his town under false pretenses, that she had misrepresented herself in correspondence, that she was possibly some kind of confidence trickster preying on honest American men. He described her seeds as witches' ingredients to a group of women at the dry goods counter, and one of those women repeated it to another, and within a week, Fannie found that certain doors in Caldwell were cooler than they had been. Fannie heard about this through Mrs. Alderman, who was the most effectively connected information network in the county, and who delivered the intelligence with a brisk directness that Fannie found refreshing compared to the alternative, which would have been discovering it through a series of small social mortifications. "He's a fool and a bully," Mrs. Alderman said, "and most people in this town know it. But he's also been here 15 years, and he controls the supply of a lot of things people need, so they don't like to cross him." "I understand," Fannie said. "Isaiah Brooks, Mrs. Alderman said carefully, with the tone of someone introducing a subject without appearing to introduce a subject, has been a customer of Harlan's for years, but he's always bought only what he couldn't source elsewhere. He doesn't owe Harlan anything." "I'm not looking for a protector," Fannie said. "No," Mrs. Alderman agreed, "but sometimes what we need and what we're looking for are different things." Fannie thought about this for a long time after Mrs. Alderman left the room. What she needed in the purely practical sense was clear enough: employment, income, a legal status in this country that was not dependent on a marriage to Harlan Price, and a piece of ground where she could plant her seeds. She was educated, she spoke multiple languages, she had a thorough and working knowledge of agriculture, and she was not afraid of hard work. These were real resources. She needed to find a way to convert them into something that would sustain her. She began with what she could do immediately. She offered Mrs. Alderman a reduction in her board in exchange for cooking the household's meals. Mrs. Alderman agreed with suspicious speed, which suggested she had been considering this proposition before Fannie raised it. Fannie cooked the way her mother had taught her, with deep knowledge of flavor and technique, with herbs from her tin box that transformed the simple ingredients available in Kansas into something layered and surprising. And within 2 weeks, Mrs. Alderman had 3 new boarding requests from people who had heard about the food. She then approached the owner of the small restaurant on the main street, a taciturn German-American man named Becker, and proposed to supply him with fresh herbs on a weekly basis in exchange for a corner of his back lot to use as a kitchen garden. Becker agreed, mostly because she cooked him a sample meal that left him sitting silently at his own table for several minutes before saying simply, "Yes, fine." She planted her first Kansas garden in that back lot in the 2nd week of April. She put in the herbs first, the most practical, the most likely to succeed, and set aside her more precious seeds for when she had better soil and more space, and a clearer understanding of what this particular stretch of the Great Plains would allow. Isaiah came by Becker's restaurant on a Thursday and found her in the back lot on her hands and knees, working soil amendments into the earth with a quiet focus that suggested she had entirely forgotten the rest of the world existed. He stood watching for a moment that stretched longer than he intended, and then she looked up and saw him, and neither of them was embarrassed by this, which said something about the nature of the thing growing between them, which was already, after 2 weeks, more substantial than either of them had yet admitted aloud. "Your soil amendment," he said, nodding at the pail beside her. "Ash and dried manure," she said. "It is what I could find. Not ideal, but better than nothing." "I have compost," he said. "Well-aged, 2 years at least. Good bacterial activity. The garden has been doing well on it." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You are offering me compost." "I am offering you compost," he confirmed without any visible self-consciousness. She recognized in this moment that this was the most romantic thing anyone had said to her in years. She did not say this aloud. Instead, she said, "When could you bring it?" "Saturday morning," he said. He arrived Saturday before the town was fully awake, with a wagon loaded with 2 barrels of exactly what he had promised, and he helped her work it into the soil of the back lot. And they worked side by side for 3 hours without any awkwardness at all, which was itself remarkable, because there was a great deal of charged awareness between them that might easily have produced awkwardness in less self-possessed people. They talked while they worked about growing things, about Kansas weather, about the difference between the dry climate of the plains and the Mediterranean coastal humidity Fannie's plants had evolved in, about the possibilities and limitations of transplanting something from one world into another. "My grandmother used to say," Fannie said, pausing to rest, "that a seed does not know where it came from. It only knows what it needs: water, warmth, soil, the right conditions. Give it those things and it does not mourn its homeland." "Do you," Isaiah asked, "mourn your homeland?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the turned earth in front of her. "I mourn my mother," she said. "Lebanon is a place. My mother was a person. Those are different kinds of loss." "Yes," he said, and he said it with a simplicity that told her he understood the distinction not academically but personally. She looked at him. "What did you leave behind in Tennessee?" The question sat between them for a moment. He set down the shovel he'd been using and looked out over the flat plain stretching south toward the territory. "My father's farm," he said, "which I didn't want and couldn't save. He lost it to debt when I was 20. I tried for 2 years to earn enough to buy it back and couldn't. So I stopped trying to recover the past and started trying to build something forward." "That is hard," she said. "It was," he agreed. "And then it wasn't. The past stays where you put it, mostly." She thought that was one of the more honest things she had heard anyone say about grief and loss, and she stored it away with the same care she gave to her seeds as something worth preserving. By the end of April, 3 things had happened simultaneously that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Fannie's herbs were growing. The mint was lush and explosive, the way mint always is once it decides it approves of its location. The thyme had taken root with careful determination. The chamomile was sending up its first delicate fronds. The za'atar, which was essentially a variety of wild thyme, wild oregano, and sumac, a flavor combination that had no exact American equivalent, was establishing itself with a stubborn vigor that Fannie recognized as a family trait. The second was that Harlan Price escalated his campaign of reputation damage to include a direct complaint to the county sheriff, a man named Dolan who was not corrupt exactly, but who was significantly influenced by the opinions of established business owners, which meant he was significantly influenced by Harlan. Dolan paid Fannie an official visit at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house and asked a series of questions about her immigration status and her arrangements that were designed to make her feel precarious and unwelcome. Fannie answered every question calmly and correctly, because she had done nothing wrong and her immigration papers were in perfect order. She had come through the port of New Orleans as a legal immigrant and had documentation to prove it. But the visit shook her in ways she did not fully show, because it reminded her that her position in this country was not as secure as her competence made it feel. The third thing was that Isaiah Brooks asked her if she would like to see his farm. She said yes. He drove her out on a Sunday, the wagon rolling through the wide prairie morning with the larks going up around them in spiraling columns of song, and she sat beside him on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes taking in everything: the quality of the light, the color of the soil where it was exposed at the road's edge, the vegetation in the creek bottom, the relationship between the land and the sky, which out here was enormous and uncompromised in a way that still shocked her after 6 weeks. The farmhouse was better than she had imagined. She had pictured something minimal and functional, but he had built it with more care than that. The proportions were right. The windows were well placed for both light and ventilation. The covered porch faced east exactly as he had told her, and the deep eaves over the south-facing kitchen window would shade it in summer. He showed her the garden. It was a good working vegetable garden, competently maintained, practical and productive, but without any of the layered complexity that she recognized from the gardens of her childhood. It was an American prairie garden, designed to feed a person through a year, not to explore the full possibility of what a piece of earth could become. He walked her around the perimeter of the cultivated land, and then beyond it, out to the untouched section of his acreage, a long south-facing slope above the creek that was covered in native grass and had never been broken. She stopped at the crest of the slope and looked down at the creek running below, and the light was coming through the cottonwoods along the bank in long green shafts, and the soil at the edge of the slope, where a small erosion cut exposed the profile, was deep and black and rich, and she felt something shift inside her chest that was part longing and part recognition, and part something she was not yet quite ready to name. "This slope," she said. "I've been thinking about it for years," he said, "but I didn't know what it wanted." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her, not at the slope. "Figs," she said, "pomegranates if the winters aren't too severe, possibly grapes along the southern face, native herbs along the creek bank, a kitchen garden at the top where you get the full day's sun." She stopped herself. "I apologize. I am describing your land as though I have some claim on it." "You might," he said. The word fell into the silence between them like a stone into water, and the ripples went out and out. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully. "Isaiah," he said. "Isaiah," she said, and the name fit oddly and then perfectly in her mouth. "I need you to understand something about my situation. I came to this country under an arrangement that failed. I am living on credit that I am working to repay. I have no family here, no connections beyond the few I have built in the past 6 weeks, and a man who actively wishes me harm and has the social influence to complicate my life considerably. I cannot afford to make another mistake about someone's intentions." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that direct and steady attention. "My intentions," he said, "are to ask you if you would consider working this land with me, formally, as a partner. You know things about plants and soil and growing that I don't know. I have land and stability and labor. Between us, we could build something that neither of us could build alone." He paused. "That is one intention. The other intention, which I am also being honest about, is that I would very much like to know you better, and if that led somewhere you were willing to go, I would consider that the best outcome I could imagine." She looked at the slope. She looked at the creek. She looked at the sky over the Kansas plain, enormous and blue and indifferent in the way of all large things. "I would need to maintain my own income," she said. "I would not be dependent on your goodwill for my survival. That is not a reflection of distrust of you specifically. It is a rule I have made for myself." "That is entirely reasonable," he said. "And I would need time," she said. "I have been in this country for 6 weeks. I have known you for 2. I am not in a position to make permanent decisions about my life based on kindness and good compost, however much I appreciate both." He almost smiled. It transformed his face entirely, that almost smile. "All the time you need," he said. "Then yes," she said, "I would like to work this land." The arrangement they made was practical and carefully defined. Fannie would come to the farm on Tuesdays and Saturdays to work the new garden plot she designated on the south-facing slope, using seeds and cuttings from her tin box, supplemented by additional plant material. She would source through correspondence with botanical suppliers in the East. She would maintain her own herb business with Becker's restaurant, and the growing number of households that had discovered her dried herbs were superior to anything available in Harlan Price's store. Isaiah would provide soil amendments, water access, tools, and his own labor when available, and any produce sold from the new garden would be split equally. It was an agreement that made excellent practical sense. It was also, transparently, a reason for 2 people who were powerfully drawn to each other to spend a great deal of time together in a setting where they had a legitimate shared purpose, which allowed the drawing toward each other to happen at a pace that did not frighten either of them. Through May, they planted. Fannie's pomegranate seeds went into prepared beds on the warmest section of the slope, protected from north wind by a line of young cottonwoods. The fig cuttings went in with great ceremony and considerable horticultural anxiety, because figs were not supposed to survive Kansas winters, and Fannie knew it, and planted them anyway with the confidence of someone who had decided that a plant which had survived in her family's garden for 200 years was not going to be stopped by a mere continental climate. "You know these might not make it through winter," Isaiah said, watching her tamp soil around the base of a cutting with decisive care. "They know it too," she said. "I am not going to tell them in advance. It would discourage them." He laughed then, a real laugh, unexpected and warm, and she looked up at him with a pleasure in having caused it that she felt through her whole body. In the evenings, after the planting work was done, they would sit on the porch of his farmhouse with whatever Mrs. Alderman had packed for her supper. She still had not been invited to stay for meals, and the propriety of this small line pleased her, because it was a line held out of genuine respect rather than coldness, and they would talk. They talked about everything. About the botany of the Near East and the agricultural history of the Fertile Crescent, which Fannie could explain with the detailed familiarity of someone whose family had been farming the same land for generations. About the settlement patterns of the Kansas plains and the complicated, violent history of the relationship between the settlers and the Comanche and Kiowa peoples whose land this had been before the Indian removal policies made it available for exactly this kind of farming. And this Isaiah discussed with a directness that she respected, because he did not pretend it was uncomplicated. "My father's farm in Tennessee," he told her one evening, "was built on land that had been Creek territory not 40 years before. He never talked about that. I think about it sometimes. My family farmed land in Lebanon," she said, "that had been farmed by different families before us and different ones before them. Land has a history. You cannot erase it. You can only decide what kind of steward you will be going forward." He thought about this for a long time after she had gone home. June came and the Kansas heat arrived in earnest, a dry, beating heat entirely unlike the humid warmth of the Mediterranean coast, and Fannie learned quickly that her plants would need more water than she had initially planned for. The creek was reliable, but carrying water up the slope by hand was time-consuming, and she began to think about an irrigation system, shallow channels cut into the slope to direct creek water to the planted beds in a pattern her grandmother had used on the Beirut hillside, a technique that was thousands of years old and perfectly suited to exactly this geography. She described it to Isaiah. He understood it immediately, which pleased her more than she would have predicted. They spent a Saturday designing the channel layout together, working from a sketch she drew on the back of an old seed catalog, and the conversation spiraled out from irrigation into the broader question of what the farm could eventually become, a conversation that required them to think about the future as a shared space. "You're describing something that would take years," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "So you're thinking about being here for years." She looked at the map she had drawn, at the careful lines of proposed channels, at the small notations she had made in Arabic in the margins. "I am trying to think about permanence," she said. "I have not been good at it. My life has not invited permanence, but I am trying." "Permanence is something you build," he said, "piece by piece, like this." He gestured at the slope, at the young plantings, at the sketch. "You don't arrive at it, you construct it." She looked at him then, and the space between them on the porch steps was very small, and the evening light was doing something extraordinary to everything it touched, and she thought that this man had given her something larger than he knew, not just soil and tools and honest conversation, but the radical idea that the future was something she could build rather than something that would happen to her. She did not say any of this. She said, "The first irrigation channel should go in before the July heat peaks." "Saturday," he agreed. They dug the first channel on a Saturday so hot that the air above the dry grass shimmered in waves, and the creek water felt like the best thing that had ever existed. They worked all morning, stopping frequently to drink water and step into the creek up to their shins. And at midday, they sat in the shade of the cottonwoods and ate the food she had brought, bread she had baked that morning with herbs pressed into the crust, hard cheese, dried fruit, a jar of the honey Isaiah had given her 2 months ago, repurposed now into something she had made, which felt significant in a way she could not entirely articulate. "Fannie," he said, and her name in his mouth had developed over the past weeks a quality she could feel. "Yes," she said, "I would like to be plain with you about something." She turned to face him fully. "All right. I am in love with you," he said. "I don't say that to pressure you into anything. I say it because you deserve to know where you stand with me, and because I think being honest about it is better than going on being carefully indirect when we both know what this is." The creek ran. The cottonwood leaves turned in the small breeze. A red-tailed hawk was working a thermal somewhere above the slope behind them. She thought about her mother's face. She thought about the tin box of seeds. She thought about what it cost to leave everything familiar behind and try to put down roots in foreign soil. "I am afraid," she said. "I want you to know that too, not of you, of what it means to want something this much when I am still not certain of my footing." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be unafraid. I'm asking you to let me be someone you can trust while you're figuring out the footing." She reached out then, a small movement, barely noticeable, and touched the back of his hand where it rested on the grass between them. He turned his hand over and took hers, and they sat in the cottonwood shade beside the creek, with their hands linked, and said nothing, because nothing else needed to be said right now. What happened next with Harlan Price happened because Harlan was not someone who accepted irrelevance gracefully. At the end of June, he went to a man named Clive Marsh, who was a lawyer of deeply flexible ethics operating out of Wichita, and he paid Marsh to investigate whether there was any legal mechanism by which Fannie could be declared in breach of the correspondence arrangement he claimed constituted a binding contract. This was a desperate and probably futile avenue of attack, but Harlan was running out of options and was primarily concerned with causing trouble rather than winning anything definitively. Marsh arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in early July and presented himself at Mrs. Alderman's door with a letter and a very unpleasant smile. The letter claimed that Fannie owed Harlan Price $40, the cost of her passage plus damages for the breach of agreement, constituted by her refusal to proceed with their engagement, and that if these funds were not repaid within 30 days, legal action would be initiated. Fannie read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and went to find Isaiah. She found him at the farm in the middle of replacing a section of fence on the east pasture, and she rode out on the mare she had recently learned to handle well enough for short distances, and she dismounted at the fence line and handed him the letter without a word. He read it. His jaw tightened. She watched the movement of it, the controlled anger, the deliberateness with which he set the letter down and thought before speaking. $40, he said. "Which I owe you anyway," she said. "So technically I owe 80. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Isaiah," she said firmly, "we had an agreement. I told you I would pay you back." He looked at her for a moment. "All right. You'll pay me back from the garden proceeds, as we discussed. But this letter from Marsh, this is harassment, not a legitimate claim. A correspondence arrangement is not a legally enforceable contract under Kansas law. I'd like to talk to a lawyer." "Do you know one?" "There's a man in Wellington named Carter who does good work. I'll ride over this week." Carter confirmed in a letter that arrived the following week that Harlan's claimed contract had no legal standing. Marsh's letter was nothing more than an expensive intimidation attempt. Carter drafted a response, sent it to Marsh's Wichita office, and the matter was legally closed. Harlan received the news with the impotent fury of a man who had run out of legitimate weapons and was now considering illegitimate ones. What he settled on was not violent, but it was petty and harmful in the way that petty people, when cornered, often resort to. He went to the county commissioner and suggested that the creek water rights for the south section of Isaiah's land rights that had never previously been questioned might be reviewed in light of some irregularities in the original filing. This was a dangerous move, not because the claim had merit, but because water rights in Kansas were genuinely contested and complicated, and a challenge could create uncertainty and legal costs even when ultimately defeated. Isaiah came to Fannie on a Thursday evening with the commissioner's notice in his hand and a very controlled expression on his face, and she read it and felt a cold wave of something that was partly fear and partly fury on his behalf. "He is doing this because of me," she said. "He's doing this because he's a vindictive man who can't stand losing," Isaiah said. "This is not your fault. It is, in the practical sense. He would not be targeting your water rights if you had not helped me." "Then I'm glad I helped you," he said simply, definitively, and the simplicity of it landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go to the original filing," he said. "I have all the documentation. Carter will review it this week. If the filing is solid, and I believe it is, there is no basis for the challenge. And if it is not solid," he was quiet for a moment, "then we fix whatever needs fixing, and we don't panic." She looked at him and thought, this is a man who has spent years building something from nothing, and he is not afraid of difficulty because he knows how to work through it. And she thought, I am tired of being afraid of what someone else can take from me. I would rather focus on what I am building. "The pomegranates are showing secondary growth," she said. He blinked at the change of subject and then gradually understood it. "Are they?" "The fig cuttings also. 2 of the 3 have established root systems. I checked them this morning." "You were going to tell me that today anyway," he said. "Yes. And I am telling you now, because the water rights challenge is a thing we will deal with, and the plants growing is also a thing that is happening, and I want to talk about the plants." He came and sat beside her on the porch bench, and she described what she had seen in the plantings that morning, with the careful precision of someone who had been watching these particular plants since birth. And he listened with the focused attention she had come to understand as one of his deepest qualities. And by the time she was done describing the secondary leaf formation on the fig cutting, the tension in the line of his shoulders had eased. Carter's review of the water rights filing found it to be legally sound, as Isaiah had believed. The commissioner reviewed Carter's response and within 3 weeks dismissed Harlan's challenge as without merit. Harlan was left with no remaining legal avenue for harassment, a significantly diminished standing in the community. Several people had noticed the pattern of his behavior toward the foreign woman and her protector, and had formed conclusions unflattering to Harlan, and a growing recognition that he had not simply lost a potential wife, but had, through his own pettiness and cruelty, lost something he had not properly valued until he saw what Isaiah Brooks was building with it. August arrived and the Kansas plains entered their fullest heat, and the south-facing slope on Isaiah's farm was, improbably and stubbornly and magnificently, growing things that no one in Caldwell, Kansas had ever seen. The pomegranates were not yet fruiting. They were young plants, still in their first season, building root systems, but they were vivid and green and alive in a way that commanded attention. The figs, all 3 surviving cuttings, had exceeded everyone's reasonable expectations and were putting on new growth at a rate that suggested they had decided to treat Kansas as home and would not be argued with. The herb beds were a tapestry of scent and color, the silver green of the za'atar, the bright Mediterranean blue of the rosemary that Fannie had managed to establish from dried cuttings that had been dormant for months, the pale chamomile flowers that she dried and sold in small cloth packets that Becker's restaurant could not keep stocked. People began to come and look at the slope. Not many at first, then more. The strangeness of it, these foreign plants, growing in Kansas, watched over by a woman with an accent and dark eyes and hands perpetually stained green from working the soil, attracted a kind of reluctant curiosity that gradually became something closer to respect. Mrs. Alderman came one Saturday and walked the entire slope with Fannie, asking questions about each plant with the methodical interest of a woman who had always kept a kitchen garden and recognized excellence when she saw it. A farmer from the county's north section came with his wife and admired the irrigation channels and asked Fannie to explain the design, which she did, sketching it on the ground with a stick, and the man went home and adapted it for his own property. Isaiah watched all of this with a quiet satisfaction that had several layers to it. The first layer was the simple pleasure of good work bearing fruit. The slope had always seemed like it was waiting for something, and now it was getting it. The second layer was specific pride in Fannie, in the knowledge and patience and skill she brought to the land, which was doing something for his farm that he could not have done without her. The third layer was the one he thought about most, which was that she was here, increasingly, not just as a worker or a partner in the agricultural sense, but as someone who belonged to this place, who had put pieces of herself into the soil of it, and whose presence made the whole farm feel more like what he had always, without quite articulating it, wanted it to become. He asked her to dinner in September. A proper dinner, inside, at his kitchen table, which he set with the good dishes he had bought in Wichita 2 years ago and never used. He cooked badly, cheerfully, without pretense, a meal that combined his best beef roast with the herbs she had been growing, which transformed it into something that smelled extraordinary and tasted even better. She arrived as the sun was going low, and she came through the door of the farmhouse and stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway looking at the table, at the lit lamp, at the attempt he had made, and something in her expression went soft and open in a way she did not try to conceal. "You set the table," she said. "I own dishes," he said. It seemed wasteful not to use them. She sat down across from him and they ate together for the first time, a meal that lasted 2 hours because neither of them was in any hurry, and the conversation covered everything from the current price of wheat futures to the philosophy of Avicenna, whom Fannie had read in her father's library, and somewhere in the middle of a discussion about the agricultural writings of Al-Awwam, a 12th century Arab agricultural scientist whose encyclopedic knowledge of plants Fannie found both professionally relevant and personally touching. She looked across the table at Isaiah Brooks and thought, "I am in love with this man." She had known it for a while in the back of her mind, where she had kept it carefully contained while she worked on the more urgent business of becoming stable and solvent and secure. But it had grown despite her containment of it, the way the herbs in her garden grew despite drought, persistently toward light, and she could not in good conscience deny it any more. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the warm September dark, and he asked her a question she had been expecting for some time. "Fannie, would you consider marrying me?" The night was full of sound insects, the distant creak, the long sigh of the prairie wind. "I want to be certain," she said, "that you are asking because you want a life with me, not because you think I need rescuing, not because you feel responsible for me, because those are not reasons." "Those are not my reasons," he said. "What are your reasons?" He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "You are the most interesting person I have ever met," he said. "When you're not here, this farm feels emptier than it ever did before I knew you, which means knowing you has ruined a perfectly functional solitude. You see things in this land that I've looked at for 9 years and never saw. You're brave in ways that most people will never have to be. And when you're happy, when something grows that you weren't sure would grow, or when you find exactly the right word in English that you've been searching for, your face does something that I would happily spend my whole life looking at." Fannie sat with this for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and they sat on the porch in the Kansas night with the immensity of the prairie spread out before them, and she thought about her mother pressing seeds into her hands on a cold November morning in Beirut, and she thought, "This is what you sent me toward. This man, this soil, this life I am going to build." They were married in October of 1878 at the Caldwell courthouse, because the question of which church was complicated by their different backgrounds. He was a lapsed Presbyterian from Tennessee, and she was a Maronite Christian from Lebanon, and they decided the courthouse was honest and uncomplicated and sufficient. Mrs. Alderman was their witness, along with a farmer named Davis who had become, over the summer, one of Isaiah's close neighbors and something like a friend to both of them. Harlan Price did not attend. He did, it was reported, hear about the wedding, and the report was that he sat down heavily in his store chair and stared at the wall for a while, which was the closest he was going to get to a reckoning. Fannie moved her 2 trunks and her tin box from Mrs. Alderman's boarding house to the farmhouse on the south edge of Caldwell, Kansas, and she stood in the doorway of the room that was now hers, that was theirs, and looked at the east-facing window and the morning light coming through it. And then she went to the kitchen and made tea with mint from the garden she had grown, and she brought 2 cups to the porch where Isaiah was sitting watching the sunrise, and she sat beside him, and this was how their mornings began. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard in Kansas, as Kansas winters are. Fannie had prepared the garden beds carefully, mulched the figs heavily, built small windbreaks for the pomegranates, covered the more tender herb plants with wooden frames and dried grass. She spent the cold months reading every piece of botanical and agricultural literature she could find or order, studying the climate data she had been collecting since April, and writing detailed notes in a combination of Arabic and English that she was slowly developing into a proper farming journal. She also began to teach herself to read English at a speed that matched her intelligence, which was considerable, and to write it with the precision of someone who had always cared about exact meaning. By February, she was writing letters in English that Becker said were better composed than most letters he received from native speakers. Isaiah spent the winter on the necessary work of the farm, livestock care, equipment repair, planning for the spring planting, and in the evenings he and Fannie sat by the fire and she read to him from her farming journal, and he made comments and suggestions, and she refined the plans for what the South Slope would become in its second year. On the 5th of March, 1879, she told him she was pregnant. He sat very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and stunned and grateful, something that made him look younger, something that was almost, she thought, like a man arriving somewhere he had been traveling toward without knowing it. Are you well?" he managed. "I am very well," she said. "I am somewhat nauseated in the mornings but entirely functional the rest of the day. I have checked Mrs. Alderman's medical almanac and everything appears normal." "You checked the medical almanac?" "Of course I did. I needed information." He stood up and came around the kitchen table and put his arms around her very carefully, and she felt him breathe against her hair, and she put her hands over his where they clasped at her waist, and they stayed like that for a long time. Spring arrived and the figs lived. All 3 of them put on vigorous growth in April, and Fannie walked the slope on the first warm Tuesday of the month, and found them and felt something so profound and complete move through her that she had to sit down on the ground between the beds and simply experience it. Isaiah found her there an hour later, sitting cross-legged between the fig plants with her hands in her lap, and he sat down beside her without asking why she was sitting on the ground, because he had come to understand that some of what happened between Fannie and her plants was not entirely explicable and did not need to be. "They made it," she said. "Yes," he said. "My mother would not have believed Kansas could grow figs." Maybe she'd have believed it if she knew about the South Slope and the irrigation channels, and the fact that you talked to them all winter through the cold frames. Fannie laughed. It was a laugh that came from somewhere deep and clear, and it lifted into the April air and went out over the slope and the creek and the flat horizon of the plain. "I am going to write it down," she said. "Everything I know about growing these plants in this climate, so other people can try." "That's a book," he said. "Perhaps it is," she said. That autumn in November of 1879, their son was born. They named him Elias, which worked in both English and Arabic, which felt right. He arrived with a great deal of decisive energy, announced himself loudly, and proceeded to attach himself to the world with the wholehearted commitment of a plant that has found good soil. He had Fanny's dark eyes and Isaiah's broad build, and a quantity of dark hair that stood up from his head in a way that delighted everyone who saw him. Isaiah held his son for the first time with the same quality of stunned gratitude that had been on his face when Fanny told him about the pregnancy, and Fanny, tired and satisfied and deeply, overwhelmingly glad, watched her husband hold their boy and thought about all the miles and losses and false starts and acts of small courage that had led to this room, this man, this child. Mrs. Alderman, who arrived the next morning with a pot of stew and a blanket she had been knitting since July, declared Elias to be the finest baby in Caldwell County, and presented her opinion with the confidence of someone who expected no argument and received none. Life on the Brooks farm in the years that followed had a quality that people who visited sometimes struggled to describe but always remembered. It was not simply productive, though it was certainly that. The South Slope had, by the time Elias was 2 years old, become something genuinely extraordinary, a working example of what Fanny called mixed heritage cultivation, a combination of the traditional Mediterranean planting techniques her family had practiced for generations with the practical adaptations required by the Kansas climate. The figs fruited for the first time in 1881, and Fanny stood in the hot August afternoon holding the first ripe fruit in her hand and looking at it for a very long time before she bit into it. And the sweetness of it was so complete and so specific, not quite like the figs of her childhood, shaped by different soil and different light, but unmistakably itself, unmistakably her family's fruit, growing in Kansas, that she cried, quietly, privately, into the leaves of the tree. Isaiah found her a few minutes later and understood without asking, and he simply stood beside her with one hand on her back, and after a moment she handed him the fig and he tasted it, and the look on his face told her that he understood, at least partially, what it meant. The pomegranates fruited the same autumn. They were smaller than the ones she remembered from Beirut, but brilliant red and richly flavored, and Fanny made preserves from them that Mrs. Alderman declared to be the finest thing she had ever tasted, and which Becker put on his restaurant menu and charged for accordingly. Fanny's farming journal, which she had been expanding since 1878, had by 1882 become a manuscript of considerable depth and practical value, documenting her methods for adapting Mediterranean and Levantan plants to the Kansas climate, her irrigation designs, her soil amendment techniques, and the specific cultivation history of each plant she had introduced to the slope. She sent copies to the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan and to a botanical journal in Boston, and both responded with significant interest. The Botanical Journal published a condensed version in 1883 with Fanny's full name attached. It was, as far as either she or Isaiah could determine, the first agricultural publication in the state of Kansas to be authored by a woman from Lebanon. Fanny held the journal for a long time when it arrived in the mail, and then put it on the shelf beside her tin box, which still sat on the kitchen windowsill, holding the seeds that had not yet found their moment. By 1883, Isaiah and Fanny had expanded the farm to just over 500 acres through the purchase of a neighboring parcel, whose owner had decided to return east. They had a small orchard, a productive kitchen garden, the continuing wonder of the South Slope, and a working wheat and cattle operation that was among the more stable in the county. They also had, by the spring of 1883, a second child on the way. Their daughter arrived in September of 1883, in a late summer heat that broke 2 days after her birth into a cool, perfect autumn. They named her Miriam, which was the name of Fanny's mother, and she arrived in the world with the same decisive energy as her brother and the same dark eyes, but with an additional quality of focused attention that she directed, from almost the moment of her birth, at every new thing in front of her, with an intensity that made both her parents feel, simultaneously, very seen and very inspected. Elias, 4 years old, accepted his sister with the philosophical pragmatism of a child who had been promised something interesting, was coming, and was reserving judgment until the interesting part became apparent. Harlan Price had, in the years since his failed campaign against Fannie, slowly and inevitably marginalized himself. His attempts to weaponize the community against her had produced the opposite of the intended effect. The community had watched her build something real on the south slope of the Brooks farm, had tasted the herbs and the preserves and the figs, had read about her work in the Agricultural Journal, and had concluded that she was one of the more interesting and valuable things that had happened to Caldwell in recent years. Harlan's store continued to operate, but he had lost whatever social centrality he had previously enjoyed, and by 1882, he was simply a sourly middle-aged merchant with a diminishing customer base and too much time to spend regretting his choices. He left Caldwell in 1884, relocating to Wichita, and his departure produced in the community a relief so collective that it was almost comic. His store was purchased by a young couple from Ohio, who made it a much more pleasant establishment, and Caldwell as a whole continued its transition from a raw cattle trail town into something more permanent, more settled, more like a place that intended to last. On an evening in April of 1885, Isaiah and Fannie sat together on the east-facing porch of their farmhouse, watching the last light come across the prairie in the long, golden waves that April alone produces on the Kansas plain. Miriam was asleep inside. Elias, 6 years old and in possession of strong opinions about bedtime, was allegedly also asleep but could be heard occasionally shifting. Fannie was reading from her farming journal, adding notes about the spring plantings in the careful, bilingual handwriting that had become a small artifact of her particular life: Arabic for her private thoughts about the plants, English for the technical data, a mixture when the subject required both languages to be fully said. Isaiah was watching her. He did this often, not in any intrusive way, but with the simple and ongoing appreciation of a man who has been given something he knows to be extraordinary and has not yet, after 7 years, stopped being grateful. "What are you writing?" he asked. "I am noting that the pomegranate tree on the west end of the upper bed is putting out an unusual variety of secondary growth," she said, not looking up. "The leaves are larger than the parent variety. I think it may be adapting, developing a Kansas version of itself." "Is that something plants do?" "Over generations, yes. They adapt to their conditions. The new growth is a response to what the environment requires, not the same as the original but descended from it. Carrying the essential nature forward in a new form." He thought about this. Like people. She looked up from the journal and met his eyes across the porch in the evening light. "Exactly like people," she said. She thought about the girl who had stood at the stern of a steamboat in the Gulf with $40 and a tin box of seeds and a grammar book, and an entire lost world inside her. She thought about the woman who had stood on her knees on a dirt floor in Harlan Price's general store and not broken. She thought about the first time she had seen this slope, this creek, this light, and felt something click into place like a key in a lock that had been waiting. She looked at the farm, at the figs standing against the April sky, at the pomegranate hedge along the upper bed, at the irrigated channels she had cut into the slope with her own hands, at the farmhouse her husband had built with its east-facing porch and its well-placed windows and its kitchen that smelled always of herbs and bread and something that had no name except home. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "My mother was right about the seeds." He waited. "She said that a seed does not know where it came from. It only knows what it needs. And if you give it the right conditions, it does not mourn the place it left. It becomes something new in the place it found." She looked at the farming journal in her lap, at the pages of careful notes that were themselves a kind of seed knowledge preserved and passed forward. "She gave me these seeds so that something of her would continue growing in a new place. And they grew, because of you, because of this land, because you gave them, because you gave me soil worth growing in." He crossed the porch and sat beside her and took her hand, the same hand he had taken that first day in the cottonwood shade, and held it with the same care. "You grew yourself," he said. "I just made sure no one ground you into the dirt." She laughed softly and rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in the April evening, while the prairie light went slowly golden and then amber, and then the deep, particular blue that falls over the Kansas plain in the last minutes before full dark, and the farm breathed around them. The livestock settled, the trees still, the creek running its quiet permanent commentary over stones it had been discussing with itself since long before either of them arrived. Inside, there was the sound of a small boy making far too much noise for someone who was supposedly asleep. There was a baby making the small purposeful sounds of someone working out the world one piece at a time. There was a kitchen that would need to be started in the morning, a slope that would need checking, seeds in a tin box on the windowsill that had not yet found their moment, but were waiting with the patient confidence of things that know they will. In 1887, Fannie submitted a full monograph on what she called the naturalization of Mediterranean cultivars in the central Great Plains to the Kansas State Agricultural Society. It was presented at the annual conference in Topeka that September, delivered by Fannie herself to an audience of 200 farmers and agricultural scientists, and it was received with the kind of sustained, thoughtful silence that precedes genuine impact. She traveled to Topeka for the conference with Isaiah, who sat in the front row in his good suit, and watched his wife stand at the podium with her notes, and her clarity and her specific, hard-won knowledge, and deliver 40 minutes of the most practically useful botanical information the Kansas plains had heard in years. And he was so proud of her that he had to pay close attention to keeping his expression composed. Afterward, a professor from the agricultural college named Hartwell shook Fannie's hand and asked if she had considered a formal consulting relationship with the college. She had considered it, in fact, since approximately 1882, and said so. The arrangement they worked out provided Fannie with an income and a formal recognition of her expertise, and provided the college with access to the South Slope as a practical research site, and provided the farmers of Kansas with a gradually expanding catalog of cultivation techniques that would, over the following decade, quietly and permanently change what was possible to grow in this particular corner of the continent. In the spring of 1888, Fannie found she was pregnant again. She told Isaiah in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, with the same directness she brought to everything, and he set down his coffee cup and reached across the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her in the slow, thorough way that 7 years of morning kisses had not remotely diminished, and she laughed against his mouth and said, "You are going to tip the coffee." He was not tipping the coffee. He was, as she was fully aware, not thinking about the coffee in the slightest. Their second son arrived in November of 1888, in a cold snap that covered the South Slope in the first frost of the season, and revealed, in the morning light, how well protected Fannie's plantings were, the mulching, the windbreaks, the carefully tended root systems of 11 years of cultivation, all doing their work precisely as intended. They named him Samuel because it sounded equally at home in Tennessee and Beirut, and he was a round, cheerful, notably loud child who from his first weeks showed an interest in watching things grow that suggested he might, in time, find his place alongside his mother in the garden. Elias, 9 years old, immediately declared himself Samuel's primary protector and supervisor, a role he executed with the zealous competence of a child who takes his responsibilities very seriously. Miriam, 5, examined her new brother with her characteristic focused assessment, and then gave her verdict. He will be useful eventually. This was, everyone agreed, high praise from Miriam. The Brooks farm in the late 1880s was a place that people traveled to see. Not a tourist attraction exactly. This was still a working farm, busy and purposeful, but a place whose reputation had spread along the agricultural networks of the Central Plains as somewhere that had figured out something worth understanding. The South Slope, now a decade into its cultivation, had become a remarkable thing. The original fig trees, those 3 survivors from Fannie's first planting, were mature now, productive and well-established, and they had been joined by a dozen younger trees propagated from the originals over the years. The pomegranates formed a hedge along the upper terrace that went scarlet in autumn and produced fruit in sufficient quantity that Fannie had developed a small but profitable trade in preserves. The herb beds had expanded and diversified, and the irrigation channel system she had designed in 1878 had been refined and extended until it served not just the slope but the kitchen garden and a portion of the wheat field. There were also now olive trees. 4 of them grown from the olive pits Fannie had carried from Beirut, which she had always known were impractical and had always planted anyway, season after season, in increasingly optimized conditions. In 1886, for the first time, one of them had survived a full Kansas winter. In 1887, 2 more. In 1888, all 4 were established, small but alive, adapted to the Kansas cold in a way that no olive tree had ever been adapted before, proof of what happens when someone refuses to accept that the impossible cannot slowly, over years, become possible. Isaiah found her standing in front of the olive trees one October morning in 1889, not touching them, just looking at them with an expression he had seen many times before and never entirely got used to, a complex of loss and triumph and something beyond both, the expression of a woman who carries multiple worlds inside her and has found a way to make them coexist. He came and stood beside her. She would have believed this, Fannie said. Ultimately, she would have believed it. Yes, he said. She was practical and she was stubborn, and she never accepted that a plant couldn't be grown somewhere just because no one had grown it there yet. A pause. I learned that from her. You learned a great deal from her. And she gave me the tools to teach it to someone else. She looked at him. I am going to write it all down, everything, not just the technical notes, the whole story of the seeds and what they became, so that Elias and Miriam and Samuel know where they come from, both the Tennessee side and the Beirut side. That's a good idea, he said. It is a necessary idea, she said. A tree that doesn't know its own root system is vulnerable. People are the same. He thought about his father's farm in Tennessee, the land that had been lost, the past he had spent years deliberately not looking at. He thought about the long road west and the 9 years of solitary building and the Tuesday morning that had changed everything. Then we'll sit down and tell it all, he said. You tell the Beirut side, I'll tell the Tennessee side, and between us we'll give them the whole root system. She took his hand, leaning her shoulder lightly against his, and they stood together in front of the olive trees while the October light moved over the south slope of their farm, over the figs and the pomegranates and the herb beds and the irrigation channels, over everything they had planted and tended and coaxed into being through work and patience, and the specific stubbornness of people who believe that the right conditions can make almost anything grow. The tin box was still on the kitchen windowsill. She had taken the seeds out over the years, one by one, given each its best possible chance. The box was not empty, but what remained were the seeds she was still deciding about, varieties she had not yet found exactly the right location for, possibilities she was still planning. A tin box that had crossed the Mediterranean and the Gulf of Mexico and the North American continent in a Kansas winter, that had survived a man's boot heel and a foreign lawyer's letter and 11 years of frontier farming, and was still, stubbornly, holding something in reserve. There was always more to plant. There was always more to become. In the years that followed, the 1890s, the new century eventually approaching, the Brooks farm continued to grow and change in the way that living things do when they are given good conditions and attentive care. Elias developed into a serious and skilled farmer with his father's practical intelligence and his mother's botanical intuition. And by the time he was 15, he was managing the wheat operation with a competence that allowed Isaiah to spend more time on the experimental plantings he and Fannie were always developing. Miriam grew into her focused intensity and discovered a facility for mathematics that took her, eventually, to the Agricultural College in Manhattan, where she would study and then teach, carrying her mother's methods forward through institutions as well as through soil. Samuel grew into his father's broad frame and his mother's dark eyes and had, as predicted, a profound and almost mystical relationship with growing things, spending most of his childhood in the garden with Fannie and absorbing, without seeming to study it, the complete knowledge of 10 generations of Mediterranean farmers filtered through one woman's extraordinary memory. Fannie's book was published in 1892 by an agricultural press in Kansas City, a full, proper book, not just a monograph, titled New Soil, a practical guide to Mediterranean cultivation in the Central Plains, and it contained everything she had learned and thought and developed over 14 years of growing foreign plants in Kansas earth. It was dedicated to her mother and to the land. Isaiah read it in a single evening, sitting by the fire, and came to bed with it still in his hands and said, "This is everything. It is what I know," she said, "which is what she gave me." He set the book on the nightstand and lay back and looked at the ceiling, and she could tell he was thinking about something large. "I was 22 years old when I left Tennessee," he said, "with nothing I could keep and $40, and the idea that if I went far enough west I could build something that couldn't be taken away. I spent 9 years building carefully and still felt like something was missing." She waited. And then a woman came into Harlan Price's store and got on her knees to save seeds that had crossed an ocean, and I stepped forward, and everything that had felt like absence got filled up. He turned to look at her. "I want you to know that I understand exactly what I was given. I don't think I say that enough." She looked at him in the firelight, at the face that was familiar now with all the familiarity of chosen things, not the familiar that comes from birth or obligation, but the familiar that comes from daily conscious choosing, year after year after year. "You gave me soil worth growing in," she said. "That is not a small thing. Neither is what you planted in it," he said. She reached over and took his hand on top of the book that was their life's work, resting on the nightstand of the home they had built together, on the land they had cultivated together, in the country they had both, separately and then together, chosen to make their own. Outside, the Kansas night was doing what it always did: immense, indifferent, extraordinary, the prairie breathing its long, slow breath under the weight of the stars, the south slope dark and alive with roots going deep, the creek talking to its stones, the olive trees standing in the October cold, adapted, stubborn, improbably alive. The tin box on the kitchen windowsill still held a few seeds. Tomorrow they would figure out where to put them. There was always somewhere to put them. There was always more soil. And they had learned, both of them, in their separate and then shared lives, that the right conditions could make almost anything grow: love, trust, belonging, the particular piece of a life built honestly from the inside out, from the roots up, from seeds carried across an ocean by a woman who knew that where you come from is not where you have to stop. The story does not end there, because stories like this one do not end so much as they expand. They become, over time, the root system of other stories, other lives, other plantings. Elias would marry a farmer's daughter from the North County named Clara and bring her to the farm and watch, with a smile that was entirely his father's, as she and his mother stood on the south slope discussing soil alkalinity with the focused intensity of two people who have found each other's frequency. Miriam would write papers that were read in universities she would never have believed, as a child on this farm, could be interested in her. Samuel would expand the olive grove to a dozen trees and eventually develop a variety that was genuinely cold-hardy, genuinely Kansas, and carry it under his arm to an agricultural conference in 1903, where it would be met with the particular silence that means something has changed. Fannie would live to see all of it. She would live to see the South Slope become a reference point in the botanical literature of North America, to see her methods adopted in Oklahoma and Colorado, and the Dakotas, to see her name known by people who had never been to Kansas and never eaten a fig from a tree her mother's seeds had grown. She would live to hold grandchildren on the east-facing porch while the morning light came across the plain, and she told them, in the mixture of Arabic and English that her children had grown up hearing and her grandchildren were learning to love, about a hillside above Beirut where the air smelled of cedar and thyme, and about a tin box of seeds that had crossed an ocean, and about a man who had stood between her and a bully's boot heel and offered her, in the end, something she had not dared to ask for. Soil worth growing in, and the steady, certain warmth of someone who intended to stay. Isaiah would sit beside her on that porch, as he had sat beside her for 20, then 30 years, with his hand in hers and the farm living and breathing and growing around them. And he would think, as he had thought on the very first evening, that this was the most fortunate miscalculation of his life, that he had gone in for flour on a Tuesday morning and stepped forward when every other soul in the room had stepped back, and that step had led him here, to this woman, to this life, to this particular and irreplaceable abundance. The last seeds in the tin box were planted in the spring of 1895, on a warm April morning when the prairie was beginning its annual act of transformation from gold to green, when the figs were putting out their first soft leaves, when the pomegranate hedge was brilliant with new growth, when the olive trees stood in their adapted Kansas beauty in the long slope light. Fannie planted the last seeds with Elias beside her, teaching him as she planted, explaining each one. This is wild sage from the mountain above our village. This is a variety of thyme that has not been grown anywhere outside Lebanon for 3 generations. This is a cutting from a rose that grew in my mother's courtyard and that I have been saving for the right moment. How do you know this is the right moment? Elias asked. She looked at the farm around her, at the house, at her husband coming across the upper field with Samuel on his shoulders, and Miriam running ahead of them through the spring grass with her arms wide, testing the wind, at the slope and its improbable abundance, at the irrigation channels and the fig trees and the pomegranate hedge and the olive trees standing in their patient, adapted permanence. Because everything else is growing, she said, because the soil is ready, because sometimes you save the last seeds until you are sure, truly sure, that where you're planting them is where they belong. She pressed the last seed into the dark Kansas earth with her thumb, and covered it, and sat back on her heels, and felt the sun on her face, the same sun that had shone on the hillside above Beirut and on the deck of a steamship crossing the Gulf and on the floor of Harlan Price's store where she had knelt to gather what was hers and not let it be taken. The same sun, different soil. The same essential life, expressed in a new form, not the same as what she came from, but descended from it, carrying it forward, becoming something new without forgetting what it had been. She stood up, brushed the earth from her hands, and walked toward her family through the spring morning on the south slope of the farm they had built together from seeds and soil, and the irreversible decision of a man who had chosen, on a Tuesday in 1878, to step forward. She did not look back at the tin box. It was empty now. Everything in it had been given its chance, and everything had grown.